Welcome back to Talk Testimonies, the show where we break down those big Supreme Court cases, the ones that really make you think. Today, we're diving deep into a case called Rehaif v. United States.
Oh yeah, this one was a big one. It went all the way up to the Supreme Court.
It did, and in the end, the court decided that if the government wants to convict someone of possessing a firearm as a prohibited person, like a felon or someone who's not in the country legally, well, they've got to prove that the person knew they were in that prohibited group.
Makes sense, right? You got to know you're breaking the rules to be guilty of breaking them.
Exactly. So let's rewind a bit and unpack how the court arrived at this decision and what arguments were presented along the way.
Sounds good. Let's do it.
All right. So the whole case really revolves around how a specific federal law about firearms is interpreted, specifically this idea of criminal intent.
Yeah, intent, right. That's a tricky one.
It is, and the law we're talking about makes it illegal for certain people to possess guns. And the Supreme Court had to figure out, when the law says someone knowingly violates this rule, what does knowingly actually mean?
I can see how that would be a tricky one to nail down. I mean, does it mean just knowing you have the gun? Or does it also mean knowing you're not even allowed to have one in the first place?
Right, and that's the million-dollar question.
Makes sense.
So in Rehaif, it all boils down to the word knowingly.
Okay.
It's in that part of the law that talks about the punishment.
Right.
Mr. Rehaif's lawyer argued that this knowingly shouldn't just be about possessing a gun. It should also mean knowing you're in a category of people banned from having one. In Mr. Rehaif's case, this was being in the U.S. illegally.
So his lawyer's saying it's not enough to just find a gun. You got to prove the person knew they were breaking the law by having it.
Exactly.
What was the government's response to that?
Well, before we jump into that, let's break down the arguments from Mr. Rehaif's side a bit more. What were some of the key points they made to support their interpretation of the law?
Sure. So they definitely focused on the actual wording of the law itself, specifically where that knowingly sits in relation to the whole idea of violating the law.
Interesting.
Their point was that knowingly modifies the whole violation. Not just having the gun, but also being in that banned category.
So it's like if the law says knowingly violates X, then knowingly applies to all the parts of X.
Exactly. And they also brought up this other law, the Firearm Owners Protection Act, SOPA.
Right.
When Congress passed FOPA, they added knowingly to this section of the law.
Okay.
And the defense argued that Congress didn't just throw that word in there for no reason. It was to protect people who might make honest mistakes.
So if someone genuinely had no clue they weren't allowed to have a gun, they shouldn't be punished as if they did know.
Exactly. They were trying to say that Congress really wanted to target the people who knew they were breaking the law.
So the key point here is whether the person knew they were in a category that wasn't allowed to have firearms.
Yeah, did they know? That's the big question.
And Mr. Rehaif's lawyers also brought up this interesting point about jurisdictional elements. What's that all about?
So sometimes in laws, there are these parts that just determine which court gets to handle the case, like federal versus state.
Got it.
And courts have said, sometimes you don't need to prove someone knew about those jurisdictional things.
Okay.
But the defense argued that being a prohibited person isn't just about who gets to put you on trial. It's central to why having a gun, which is normally legal, becomes a crime. It's about whether you're actually blameworthy, not just which court hears the case.
That makes sense. So in Mr. Rehaif's specific case, what did his lawyers say about his awareness of his status?
Well, they argued that he truly didn't know he was in the country illegally.
Okay.
He had been here on a student visa, and they said he was totally unaware that he'd been dismissed from school.
And that dismissal would have affected his legal status.
Yeah.
What kind of evidence did they use to try and prove this point?
They actually tried to bring in things like, get this, a hunting license he had.
A hunting license?
Yep. They argued someone with his visa could legally get a hunting license.
Okay.
Which means he probably thought he was in the clear, legally. They also pointed out that he hadn't been flagged during a traffic stop or anything.
So no red flags.
Right. And their whole point was to show that a jury should have been able to consider if he really believed he was in the country legally. If he did, then, well, he didn't knowingly break the law.
Basically, no harm, no foul if he genuinely didn't know.
Exactly. And they even brought up some hypotheticals to strengthen their argument. Like, imagine someone who came to the U.S. as a kid, a dreamer.
Okay.
They might not even fully grasp their immigration status. Or think about a student whose school loses its accreditation, but the student's clueless.
Interesting.
Under the government's initial stance, these folks could get convicted of a serious crime, even though they had no idea they were in a prohibited category.
That does seem a bit unfair, doesn't it? I mean, punishing someone who doesn't even realize they're breaking the law.
It definitely raises some eyebrows.
Yeah!
And they also highlighted how a convicted felon knows they're a felon. They've been through the legal system. But someone's immigration status, that can be a lot more unclear.
Right.
Things can change without you even knowing. They didn't want the government to be off the hook for proving this crucial bit of information.
That the person knew they were in a category that wasn't allowed to have a gun.
Right, because that's what makes having the gun illegal in the first place. Okay, so that was Mr. Rehaif's side. Now let's hear what the government had to say. They were represented by Ellen Keaton, right?
That's right. So their main point was that the law doesn't say they have to prove the person knew about their prohibited status.
Okay.
Their argument was basically everyone's responsible for knowing their own legal situation.
So if you have a gun and you happen to be in a category that can't have one, tough luck.
Well, that was essentially their argument. You knowingly broke the law just by knowingly having the firearm.
So they focused more on knowing you had the gun rather than knowing you couldn't have it.
Exactly. The government said the main thing the law is concerned with is the act of having the gun while also being in one of those prohibited categories.
Okay.
They did admit that in those hypothetical situations, like with the dreamer you mentioned, it could lead to some tough outcomes.
Right.
But they insisted that most of the time, it's pretty clear someone's prohibited, like if they're a recent felon.
I see. So how did the government address that whole issue with the word knowingly in the law?
They said that the phrase knowingly violates just means you intentionally had the firearm and, oh, by the way, you happen to be in a category that wasn't allowed to have one.
Interesting.
They basically argued that if Congress really wanted to make it a requirement to prove the person knew about their status, they would have been much clearer about it.
So they're saying Congress would spelled it out.
Exactly, especially since these cases pop up pretty often.
True. And they seem to be implying that some things, like knowing your legal status, are just common sense.
Yeah, they definitely pushed back on that. They claimed your legal status is something you either already know or should know, and they even made a comparison to statutory rape laws.
Ooh, that's a heavy one.
Yeah, in those cases, prosecutors don't usually have to prove the defendant knew how old the victim was. It's the idea that certain basic facts about yourself are things you're expected to know.
I see.
And remember how the defense argued that shifting the burden of proof to the government would complicate things?
Oh, yeah. They said it would turn trials into these deep dives into someone's past legal troubles.
Exactly, potentially confusing the jury.
Yeah.
The government really played that up. They said requiring them to prove knowledge of someone's prohibited status in every case would turn these firearm cases into these crazy long trials. They'd have to go through all this stuff about the defendant's past legal issues or try to figure out if they understood all the ins and outs of immigration law.
That does sound pretty messy.
Right. And they pointed out that in other parts of this very same firearm law, Congress did actually say a knowledge requirement was needed for certain banned statuses.
Okay, like when?
Things like restraining orders or if someone's been indicted for a crime.
So they're using those as examples where Congress did spell it out.
Precisely. Their point was, if Congress didn't put an explicit knowledge requirement for Mr. Rehaif's situation, it must have been on purpose.
I can see their logic there.
Yeah.
So after all that back and forth, how did the justices seem to be leaning?
Well, the justices had a lot of questions for both sides. It was clear they were really grappling with all the nuances of this case.
As they should, right? These are the tough questions.
Absolutely. They were especially interested in those hypothetical cases the defense brought up, like the dreamer scenario.
Yeah, that was a tough one.
Right. And they dug into the difference between making a mistake about the law versus making a mistake about a fact.
Yeah. Those could be very different things.
Exactly. And they even questioned how much someone would need to know.
Like, would it be enough to know your visa had rules? Or would you need to know every single detail about what those rules meant?
Precisely. They were trying to pinpoint where to draw the line on this whole knowing thing.
I see. That makes sense.
The justices also pressed both sides on the practical implications of each of their positions.
So would forcing the government to prove knowledge in every case make things too difficult for them?
Exactly. Or, on the flip side, would it be unfair to convict people who genuinely didn't know they were breaking the law?
Yeah, that's a tough balance to strike.
And throughout all this, they kept coming back to this fundamental legal idea called mens rea.
Mens rea.
Basically, the idea that to be guilty of a crime, you have to have had a guilty mind. You have to have intended to do something wrong.
Right.
And they even brought up a past case called Morissette, which dealt with knowingly handling government property. They wanted to figure out whether this case with Mr. Rehaif and the prohibited status should be treated similarly to that older case in terms of needing to prove knowledge.
Interesting.
So after hearing all that, let's put on our 10th Justice hats for a minute.
Okay, I like this part.
Considering all the arguments, what's your take on the case?
Well, as the 10th Justice, I'd say this case really highlights a clash between two important principles. On one hand, we've got the government's duty to keep guns out of the hands of people who aren't allowed to have them. That's about public safety, and it's a big deal. But then there's this whole concept of knowingly in the law. That suggests Congress didn't want to punish people who were genuinely clueless about breaking the rules.
So it's a balancing act, right? Public safety versus fairness to the individual.
Exactly. And I think it's super important to draw distinctions between the different categories of people who are banned from having guns.
Yeah.
Take a felon, for example. They know they're a felon. They've been through the legal system, so they're aware of their status.
Right.
But for someone whose status might depend on more complex or less clear-cut situations, it's not so simple.
Like those immigration law scenarios you mentioned earlier.
Exactly.
Huh.
A blanket rule might not be the best approach here.
So what do you think would be a better way to handle this?
Well, I think a more nuanced approach would be to start with the assumption that someone knows their prohibited status for those more obvious cases, like the felon.
Okay.
But, and this is crucial, that assumption should be able to be challenged. If someone can credibly prove they truly didn't know their status, especially if it wasn't because of something they did directly, or if they never got a clear notification, then the case should be treated differently.
So a sort of middle ground that takes both sides into account.
Exactly. That way, we can respect the government's need to enforce these laws while also making sure we're not punishing people who genuinely made a mistake.
A very thoughtful approach. Well, that was a fascinating deep dive into Rehaif of the United States, a case that really makes you think about what it means to knowingly break the law.
Definitely thought-provoking.
It also highlights how important it is to carefully interpret the language of our laws and consider the intent behind them. We hope this conversation has helped you understand these complex issues a bit better.
Me too.
And we encourage you to keep thinking about these important legal questions. What are your thoughts on this? Join us next time for another deep dive into a significant legal or societal topic here on Talk Testimonies.